Communication is certainly a very deep thing, and it's even more difficult between groups that have different viewpoints or across cultures. And I'm going to take you on a journey, both metaphorically and in a sense literally, to talk about good communication and working at the interface, I stress that word interface, working at the interface of cultures. Now let's take an example. If I move over to the board and just draw an abstract idea of, say, a major highway. And here in Central Australia, the Stuart Highway is very important to us. So imagine the Stuart Highway. It's a long, straight road taking us to our goal, which is usually for us either Adelaide or Darwin, but we'll talk about Darwin. So we want to get to Darwin. And here we've got this road. Let's just bring it in a little bit. And let's just talk about it. So if I talk about the road, when we travel down a road, we've had to learn a rule book, haven't we? We had to go to the, RDA or whatever to pass our test, get a license. And when we're on the road, we know that, say, for instance, we should drive on the left-hand side. And that's pretty important in the territory because we get a lot of tourists from overseas who sometimes think they should drive on the right-hand side. Driving down the road, we know that the Stuart Highway is basically a very good road compared to the old days. You go over nice bridges, you can go a decent speed when the country, the bush is cut back either side. You know that other people on the road understand the rules, that they're going to drive on the left-hand side, that you're going to have signposts telling you how far it is to a certain place. So you feel secure. Even if you don't know the countryside, you have those brown signs that tell you, tourist signs that tell you how far it is to Catherine Gorge, or, the Devil's Marbles, where to stop for them. So basically, understanding the rules, being able to understand and read the signs, you're right. You're not going to get lost. There's fuel stops. You're not going to fall into a creek. You've got bridges and so on. And it's very rare that the highway's cut these days. So that's the first example. Rules on a highway, which is a bit like society. We have clear rules to operate. And, those rules were changing, there's pressures, and especially in a democratic society, so it's an ongoing process of equilibrium. But I'd like to draw your attention to one area, and that is the difference between your family and personal life and your working life. So let's imagine that one side of the road is your working life, here. That's your working life. And the other side of the road is your family life. Now what I find interesting about this is, most of the time in a family, well, we know the rules, don't we? We know our family's rules. You don't need to write it down. But in public life, rules are written down and most people abide by them and understand them. Otherwise we'd all be in prison or whatever. But our working life and our family life are two different spheres, aren't they? And within each of those spheres, we understand the rules and we operate our lives. Now let me take this a little bit further. Let's suppose that you're working with an organisation you really love. You know that it's beyond compliance. You really buy into the vision and ideals. Friday afternoon, your boss comes in and says, "Excuse me, but we've just about to land this really important piece of business and it's absolutely vital, your work. We need you here on Saturday This is make or break for us. Very, very important. But you have promised, suppose you have a son who plays footy, or a daughter that plays, I don't know, netball. You've promised them you'll go and be at their sports day. It's a big thing. They've been waiting. You work hard. You don't have enough time with your family. So what's happened to you? Your boss has walked in. What decision do you make? Do you stay at work and say, bugger the family? Or do you go to the family and say, well, don't worry about work? That is not an easy decision, is it? Because it is a no-win place to be. Because if you come back to your family and say, and tell your son or your daughter, you know by the look in their eyes what they're thinking. Your nearest and dearest. And how many of us might spend time in work only later in life to retire and be very lonely because we don't have support from our families, because we didn't support them. On the other hand, you love the work you're in and you'd like to be there. So what we see is the interface between our working lives and our family lives is not clearly defined in our society, is it? There's always constant debate. So let's draw a little bit of a jaggedy line down the middle of the road between our family life and our working life. And that interface, some of the properties, if we just look at it, I'm not here to moralise, that's very important. We're not talking about what should be done, but we're just looking at what actually is the case. So when we look at it, we can see that we have basically clear rules for work and basically clear rules for family life. But when the two conflict, that area between is a very fluid area where there's not a lot of rules, or rules aren't clear, and there can be a lot of dispute, a lot of debate, a lot of heat generated by those issues. And it absorbs a lot more of our energy than than the actual interface size itself. So the interface size is that size, our energy going into it is that size. It causes a lot of divisions, a lot of different ideas, and reduces cohesion. It's a bit like two sets of waves coming around a headland, and where they meet is extremely choppy and often very dangerous and treacherous seas. So I'd just like to leave that with you there. Not moralising, just pointing that out. Now if we take the Aboriginal road, let's just imagine how the characteristics of that road. And a lot of Aboriginal people have said, oh, well, our road is actually a very broad road. Let me draw it in black, so it's the same colour. Our road is a very broad road. But as we know, we're working towards living in harmony, different ideas coming together. But let's imagine that that's a bush highway. And the bush highways are very broad, generally very broad these days, broad roads. People like to come for their holidays and take their four-wheel drives a lot up these highways these days. But they have certain different characteristics to the Stuart Highway. Firstly, they're very broad. Secondly, they're very often not very well graded, so there's big corrugations, sometimes really big corrugations. They can be huge potholes, they can be bull dust. You can come around a corner and there's been a flash flood or thunderstorm and there's a washout and you've got a 3-foot little cliff to go down into a creek, and you're travelling at 105, 10 k's an hour. There might be a lot of cattle on that road. No fence at all. No warning, camels, whatever. So a bush road, you have rather different rules to obey, don't you? You have to often know that road really well. You have to be clear that you've got to take a lot more care. You've got to know about the countryside often. sometimes you might have no signpost to turn off to where you want to go. So you have to keep a look on the countryside and look at the hills to know where you are. So if we imagine that bush road, that unsealed road, is the Aboriginal road, it's the broad road, and we'll come on to why it's broad in a minute, but we can see the rules are different. Now let's just, once again, without moralising, just looking at this story, analogy, look at how people on the two different roads might see each other. How would you imagine that someone that is driving down the Stuart Highway, going fast, not slowing down, no need to slow down, over the creeks, sticking to the left-hand side of the road the whole time, they look across and see someone driving on the dirt road. Ooh, they're illogical. What are they doing? They're speeding up and slowing down, and then for no real reason. They're looking around at the countryside all the time. They're looking at, they're driving from side to side on the road. And of course, on your nice bitumen road, you can't see that people are driving wherever is possible, because sometimes one side is washed out or the corrugations are bad. And I have to tell you a little incident in my own. I've done so much bush driving. Going down the Tanami Highway once, I was following the least bad part of the corrugations from my point of view, and I was driving on the right-hand side of the road, and I'm coming around this big sweeping bend, and on the left-hand side is a big tanker, big road train, 3 big trolleys on the back. And he was on the other side of the road, his right side of the road. So without a blink, we just drove past each other, not the slightest problem. Now, imagine doing that on the Stuart Highway or the Pacific Highway. You just couldn't do it, could you? So the point is that someone from the Stuart Highway, the bitumen road, looks at someone on the broad road and says, whoa, why are they doing that? That's illogical. They're slow. Why are they slowing down? Why are they not doing things in a systematic way? So let's reverse that perspective. And someone from the bush road is looking at someone driving down the bitumen road, and they can't see it's bitumen, and say, whoa, that person's driving really fast. They're going straight over that creek. They haven't even slowed down for the creek. It might be a washout. And in fact, I believe last year there was a very sad accident. People drove down the old Pacific Highway somewhere near Newcastle, and the bridge had got washed out, and they went over it and they were killed. Them and 2 or 3 members of their family. So we can see perspectives are really important. When people seem to be behaving illogically, an alarm bell should go off, because most human beings aren't illogical. They work to social frameworks and laws. If we see someone as illogical, 2 alarm bells should ring. Firstly, we should ask ourselves, are they operating in a different framework? And secondly, we should ask, are they looking at us as illogical? If they do, are they going to follow our suggestions? Because when we're in the dominant culture, the Stuart Highway, or living on the East Coast, or living, where there aren't dirt roads, most people have very little idea of how to drive on a dirt road. So that's number 1, perspectives. Now I'd like to take you a little bit further in this story. And I'd like to ask you, or would like to say to you, that there is a bigger interface than just the work-family interface that we have, that we, all of us, experience, how painful that can be at times in our lives. The bigger, much bigger interface is between, and I'll put it in red, is between mainstream culture and Indigenous cultures. So we have mainstream and Indigenous cultures. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert on Indigenous cultures, but what I am saying is that I have sat at this interface, this side of the interface of course, sat at this interface for many, many years in my working and personal life. So I can talk about that interface. Just like we can experience this interface, we experience this interface when we work with Indigenous people. And Indigenous people experience this interface too. But the key thing to remember is that in mainstream culture, it's very hard for us to understand the pressures that are pushing in on everyone here for mainstream to operate. So the most obvious of this is when we go to a place, we will speak English, not the local language. Now that's fine. I'm not moralising about that or saying anything about that other than let's just consider these people here, they've already shifted and got pushed ground because they're not even using their same language. It would almost be for us if someone came to our capital, Canberra, and started talking in a different language and we had to speak that language to them in our parliament. How would we feel about that? So regardless of the morals of it, looking at the interface, let's take an example, a typical example. Now we've talked about the tension arising from being in a no-win situation when your boss has asked you to work, you would like to, but you've got to spend time with your family. If you spend time with your family, you lose, don't you? Because you've gone too far towards your family, and what's your boss going to say? Now, if you take the other decision, it's like a rat in a maze, isn't it? You'll get shocked either way. You go this way, what's your wife or husband going to say to you? What are your kids going to say to you? Now, let's suppose that you've got a case where you've got an Aboriginal person working with you. You're in a working environment. And you're working with an Aboriginal person. So let's suppose it's here. You're working with this Aboriginal person on the interface. Now I'm going to move away from, once again, I'll keep stressing, moving away from the shoulds and the morals, moving away from even, people can use culture as an excuse just to get personal benefit. Let's strip all that away and look at a case where there is genuine conflict. Okay, genuine conflict. So we stripped away someone just trying to make an excuse to get personal benefit. We stripped away the morals. Now, in this example, let us suppose, I'm just using an example, but suppose this Aboriginal person comes to you and they're in charge of a lot of money. And so are you. You might be running a community store or in charge of some program. And they've just heard that there's been a death in their family and they are the number one person responsible for that funeral. And they've got to go immediately because there'll be severe social disruption. And once again, I stress, just using this as an example because you can always find ways around, things. So what happens then? What do they do if they need to, say, fill up with a 200 litre drum of fuel in the back of a Toyota to go a long distance out bush? What are they going to do? They've got no money. It's the day before payday. So both you and that person are under a lot of stress because there aren't any rules to sort it out, are they? Because if you have you're responsible for money, then you've got to obey the laws in this area here. But if you're responsible for your family, you've got to obey family laws. And in a sense, your family's always, that pressure is always going to be greater for nearly everyone, is going to be greater. So what are you going to do? Suppose you're this Aboriginal person and you say, well, I can't go to that funeral, I have to wait. I'll wait till tomorrow. And there's huge trouble where you could have gone. So you've moved in this direction here. What are your relatives going to say to you later? Just like here, for us who sit here, what are our kids going to say to us later? We do it again, again, again. What are they going to say as they grow up to us? Hey mum, hey dad, you were never there for us when we needed you. What are people going to say to this Indigenous person? I'm serious, they're not trying it on. that this is a real issue. These people here are going to say, you weren't there for us when we needed you. You expect us to help you now? On the other hand, if this Indigenous person goes this way, what's going to happen here? What are people from here going to say? What's the government going to say? What's the, the staff of the organisation going to say? So, not talking about morals, but just talking about that situation that arises frequently for Indigenous people and for the mainstream people that work with them. So these issues, they take a lot of dealing with. And that is why Littlefish is involved in communication. Because where you have choppy seas, where you have noise, where you don't have clear rules, communication becomes absolutely vital, absolutely major. And one of the main reasons that we haven't progressed, why Aboriginal money that's spent in Aboriginal areas is not being used efficiently enough, is because we don't communicate and take into account this area here and develop strategies and ways for looking at it. Because it's not a question of morality, that's a totally separate issue, and I'll leave that to other people to debate. But if we look, it's two things. It's about travelling down, as it were, different roads. It's about perspectives. Do we acknowledge other people have a perspective? Because it's not about that acknowledgement, it's about the reality of the situation and getting to the reality. So this is a very powerful and useful tool. And when you're talking to people that have very little experience, perhaps they don't even speak another language. Perhaps very unlikely they speak an Indigenous language. So if they have very little experience, then it helps them to, you explain their own situation and then you generalise to this situation. So I'd like to sum up. I'd like to say that what we've talked about, we call the two roads story, the two roads idea. That what we're focusing in on is good communication across cultures, engaging. And we're talking about the interface. We're talking about experience, not morals and not should. And we're talking about building from people's experience and explaining to people from their experience and analysing the problem. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation of the two roads.